Hello and good morning. I'm Don Arleth and you're watching World News coming to you live from Warsaw. The human toll is rising. Over the past day, Russian attacks on Ukraine killed at least 7 people and wounded at least 34 more. The airstrikes primarily targeted Ukraine's capital of Kyiv and the southern port city of Odesa. Overall, the Russian army used 315 drones in the attacks, including 250 Shaheds and 7 missiles, 2 of which came from North Korea. Ukrainian air defenses managed to shoot down all of the missiles and 213 attack drones. Overnight, explosions could be heard across the Ukrainian capital as air defense systems engaged incoming targets. According to Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, the drone struck several parts of the city, making one of the heaviest attacks since the beginning of the full-scale war. In total, 4 people were wounded in Russian strikes on the Ukrainian capital. Meanwhile, residents of Odesa also endured a very difficult night as Russian drones repeatedly struck the city. According to Odesa's governor, Oleg Kipur, the attack killed 2 people and wounded at least 8 more. A maternity hospital was also hit. However, the staff and patients suffered no injuries. At the same time, Russian forces also struck Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, killing 5 people and injuring a further 22. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the latest wave of drone and missile attacks on Kyiv and Odesa in a social media statement. Zelensky wrote that it is vital for the world to respond not with silence, but with concrete action. The recent escalating attacks between Russia and Ukraine show how complex modern war technology is becoming, especially when it comes to the use of drones and artificial intelligence. Vytautas Malinonis, the National Defense Foundation, shed some light on the subject in a conversation with TVP World.
Attacking of civilian infrastructure is it's getting more complex, even taking into consideration that drone technologies are also, entering the theater of war. And just recent Ukrainian successful attack on 4 airfields in Russia. Then they targeted strategic aviation, nuclear strategic aviation. This also can fire back, and those technologies shows us that we are very vulnerable in the West because it's cheap, and not only conventional or those tools and weapons which are used to it, like rockets, yes, airplanes. But the drone technologies plus artificial intelligence technologies are also approaching, and it's also we don't have experience and we don't have the knowledge how to cope with that. So, but basic principles of war is the best defense is an attack. So we should focus not only on defensive capabilities, but also on attack capabilities, including newest drone technologies, UAVs, and plus artificial intelligence. As Ukrainian and Russia, by the way, also now they are experts in using those technologies, and we see how fast they are developing.
The war between Russia and Ukraine is accelerating as both countries develop greater attack capabilities, with one major difference. Ukraine strikes legitimate military targets only, while Russia chooses to indiscriminately terrorize the civilian population. These remarks were made by Andreas Umland in a conversation with TVP World.
All of this could have been, of course, avoided if Russia would have taken Zelensky's offer to go for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Then the attack on the strategic bombers would not have happened. The attack on the Crimea so-called Crimea Bridge, the Kerch Bridge, would not have happened, and many other similar and perhaps less spectacular attacks would not have happened. The war is now accelerating in that both countries have more and more capabilities to strike the other country in the rear, and Ukraine does that, targeting military sites, and Russia does that by simply terrorizing the Ukrainian population and striking the cities, apartment houses, hospitals, universities, and so on.
In a surprising shift, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has called for increased pressure on Russia, stating that Moscow only responds to the language of force. Speaking to French's LCI television, Orbán emphasized the need for Europe to boost its military power and pursue a long-term strategic agreement with Russia.
I think the only language the Russians understand is the language of force, and Europe must be strong. We must negotiate from a position of strength. Unfortunately, right now, we are weak. That's why we need the Americans. But Europe must strengthen itself in the long term. There must be a strategic agreement with Russia, but only a strong Europe will be able to achieve that.
Romanian President Nicolae Orbán will travel to Chișinău on Tuesday for his first official visit to Moldova. The trip highlights the strong historical and strategic ties between the two neighboring countries. The Romanian head of state's first official trip to Moldova signals stronger regional cooperation as the country faces continued instability fueled by Russian interference. He will be hosted by Moldova's pro-EU President Maia Sandu in a show of Romania's support for Moldova's EU integration and democratic path. President Orbán will highlight Romania's experience with EU accession and energy cooperation, which has helped Moldova cut reliance on Russia. He described Moldova as a top priority for Bucharest in both diplomacy and development. Over 158,000 Moldovan voters took part in Romania's presidential election, with Orbán receiving strong support, highlighting the close connections between the two countries. Poland's presidential election may have brought a right-wing president, but the country's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, says that the nation's commitment to Ukraine and the West remains unchanged. That assurance from Sikorski came in an interview with Politico. Sikorski stressed that Nawrocki, backed by the Conservative Law and Justice Party, supports Poland's defense strategy and shares a strong stance against the Kremlin. He underlined that, quote, the majority of defense contracts that we are now financing were signed under the previous government. The foreign minister also pointed to Nawrocki's ties with U.S. President Donald Trump and suggested this could strengthen Poland's diplomacy with both Washington and Budapest. Sikorski concluded by expressing confidence that Prime Minister Donald Tusk's government will secure a victory in Wednesday's vote of confidence. Poland's deficit may reach 6.3% of GDP this year, the second highest in the European Union. But as Piotr Bielski, director of economic analysis in Santander Bank, says, strong growth, solid fundamentals, and a bit of luck with the help of the country will help the country, navigate through this challenge.
Good thing from the market perspective and from Ministry of Finance perspective is that for the last few years, Poland was underweight in global investors' portfolios. So they were not extremely involved, not extremely positioned in Poland. As a result, if anything, like there is not much to be sold. And maybe if the government is able to convince investors that it's still a stable political environment despite the outcome of the presidential election, and the economy will keep growing, those global investors may be still willing to buy Polish government bonds because, as I said, they are not heavily positioned, so they are not overweight.
Russia is actively expanding operations in Africa despite its war in Ukraine, according to an investigation by the Associated Press. The news agency has reported that Moscow is using its shadow fleet of aging cargo ships to ship sophisticated equipment to sub-Saharan conflict zones. Satellite imagery shows howitzers, radio jamming equipment, and other military hardware being moved from the Baltic Sea on a month-long journey to Africa. The deliveries could strengthen Russia's fledgling Africa Corps, which is replacing the Wagner Group, as the Kremlin competes with the United States, Europe, and China for greater influence across the continent. Will Poles finally see their astronaut, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski, take off on the Falcon 9 for the Axiom 4 mission? The departure has been delayed yet again. This is the third time now that the mission has been rescheduled. With more details is Piotr Orłowski at the Kennedy Space Center in the United States.
The weather is a key factor which determines whether mission proceeds or not. The Axiom 4 mission start was scheduled for today, but it was postponed due to the strong winds in the Ascent corridor. This decision was made by the weather board at the Kennedy Space Center. So now the Falcon 9 launch is targeted for tomorrow at 8 in the morning local time in Florida. Another meeting of the weather board will take place later today. According to Aleksandra Bukała, head of strategy and international cooperation in the Polish Space Agency, the mission is certified to proceed until June 15th, but it can be extended.
At the moment, we have valid flight certifications for all until June 15th, but we can request an extension until June 22nd. We don't need to rush the launch. It won't affect the mission schedule in any way, except of course for shifting the experiments. It will not impact the rotation of the permanent crew or the cargo missions.
Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski will become the second Polish astronaut to go up to space. The first was Mirosław Hermaszewski, a member of the Soyuz 30 mission, which took place in 1978. Reporting from Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, for TVP World, Piotr Orłowski.
Protests in Los Angeles against the deportation operations of the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement continue for a fourth day straight. In response to a growing unrest, President Donald Trump has decided to send an additional 2,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines to the city. Hundreds of people rallied in front of the Robert Young Federal Building in downtown Los Angeles. There are currently about 1,700 National Guard troops in the city, who will be joined by additional 2,000. Although the United States president has defended his decision to send in the National Guard, the state of California has filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration. In it, California's Governor Gavin Newsom asked a judge to declare the National Guard call-up unconstitutional and asked the court to halt any future deployments. Protesters in Los Angeles are not alone, as more demonstrations erupted across the United States. In New York City, protesters gathered in front of Trump Tower to support their West Coast counterparts. And that's all for now here on World News. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned here to TVP World for more.